Champions Chess Tour final is taking place at the moment, and I noticed that Hikaru Nakamura played the Kalashnikov Sicilian. That goes like this. And e5. Now, as many of you know, I published a course on Chessable on the Kalashnikov Sicilian. I also had a book published as well. There we go. King's Kalashnikov Sicilian. So I have a particular interest in this opening. And of course, at this time of year, I can recommend it as a wonderful present. You can get that from newinchess.com directly. So let's have a look at what happened in this game, how the players are approaching this. So this is Nodibek Abdusattorov playing white. No slouch, of course. This is the Uzbek star. So Nakamura playing black. Now, what Abdusattorov did here is unusual. The main move is knight b5, d6, and that's the Kalashnikov variation. But white does have a choice here. Now, generally, I feel that if white doesn't play knight b5, then black doesn't have any difficulties at all. You can play knight f3, knight b3, even knight f5, knight takes c6. Remarkably, seems to be quite popular at some levels. Not very good at all. Positionally, very nice for black after you recapture with the b pawn. In any case, Abdusattorov played knight e2. Now, in all my years of playing this with black, and also playing e5, the Sveshnikov variation, I have never had to face knight e2 from either opening. And this is a move which just looks strange to me because it wastes time. It's clear that this knight is going to have to move again in order to bring the bishop on f1 into the game. And in the opening, every move counts, every tempo counts. And black can develop very freely. I mean, this bishop is just on a beautiful diagonal. There's no pressure on black's centre at all. So a very surprising choice from Abdusattorov. But as we'll see, a very sharp middle game is generated. So here we go, knight c3. So white does manage to develop very straightforwardly, although, yeah, I mean, you could argue that perhaps the knight is interestingly placed on g3 because it might be able to hop into f5 later, but still, it's very time consuming. And you can see that black is doing well with development. d6. Black is slightly ahead in development. I mean, that's unusual in any opening for black to be ahead. And this next move from Abdusattorov I just find really strange. Bishop d3. This is really odd because after knight g4, white is already in massive trouble. The move you want to play is castle's kingside. But what happens? Well, queen here. This does not look good. Threatening mate. And then you have a pleasant choice between taking on f2 or, well, let's just play that one. Pin and win. After pawn takes, bishop takes g4. I mean, this is absolutely terrible. Yeah, you can also play knight takes and queen takes as well. Well, what did Abdusattorov do? Well, he compromised and played bishop e3, but of course black can just take a pawn here. And you have a choice between this or this, and this is what Nakamura did. And the knight looks pretty good on e3. Attacking the queen, queen d2. Now Nakamura decided to just remove the knight. Queen b6 looks pretty good to me. I mean, this is a rapid play game. Maybe he didn't want to sort of look at the complications after knight a4. But I think the best that white has is to play knight f1 and exchange that off. But that looks like a very comfortable pawn advantage for black. But Nakamura withdrew the knight. castles, bishop e6, the knight was pushed back, and bishop e5. And I think white does have some compensation for the pawn. Well, you can see that white is now ahead in development. Black has yet to castle. There's a little threat here. It's still very pleasant for black, actually. Rook c8 played, and I like this move a lot. If white grabs back the pawn, then positionally black is doing incredibly well. You often see these kind of positions in the Sicilian where you reach an end game and you find that black actually has the advantage because you have 4 solid pawns on the king side. That pawn on e5 supports the knight on the outpost. The king is beautifully placed in the middle. And then you can start, for example, playing moves like, you double on the c-file, perhaps advance the b-pawn and put pressure on the c-file. I mean, that's a wonderful position for black. Look at that beautiful bishop, so typical of the Kalashnikov, when it sits on e6, covered by that pawn on e5, looks in both directions. Also, crucially, it covers the 2 outposts, so you don't need to worry about the knights. But Abdusattorov did not take on d6. Instead, he played knight f5. My goodness, I'm stumbling over my words today. Knight f5. Knight hits the outpost, and this is a much better idea. And he does get some compensation for the pawn. a6 gets rid of the bishop, either retreats or, Abdusattorov decided to exchange. And g4. So he has made the best of a bad position. He's still a pawn down, but he certainly has compensation. I think white's pieces are nicely placed. These pawns, want to storm down the board. So it's not so easy for black to convert this one. I mean, it's simply quite a complicated position. I mean, particularly in rapid play. Queen a5 steps out. Okay, the counter-attack starts. So that puts some pressure on white's queen side. g5 pushes the knight from the centre. So now black always has to watch out for a knight coming in to one of these squares. Rook e1. Good move, more pressure. And, at the moment that stops the knight coming in here because that could be taken. So there's a pin. So the king finally castles on move 20. But white definitely has compensation here. I mean, even if one played the endgame, for example, after this, I think this would be a reasonable way to play. So a3. Abdusattorov didn't want to look at the complications after knight d5, queen a2. Although I think it should be fine. Without going into detail. So a3 looks reasonable, and knight f4. Okay, that's nice that this knight manages to come back into the game. But f6. So this means that black's king has to be very careful. If the position ever opens in the middle, there could be back rank problems. So this is a really tricky position. Rook fc8. Right, finally these rooks double and the counter-attack begins. So there could well be an exchange sack here. So rook e3 protects the knight. And Nakamura goes for the traditional b5. If you can open up the position, then that's fine. But there's a very, very clever idea here for black, which I think you wouldn't find in a rapid play game. But my computer points out this idea. Pawn takes pawn, king h8. Okay, let's say king b1, rook g8. Very nice idea. So black can use this rook really actively, perhaps on g2, perhaps on g6 to attack this pawn. And actually, it's very surprising, but it's very hard for white to exploit this. The rook takes control of the file. I mean, it's difficult to switch from the queen side to the king side. Very difficult to see that kind of thing. But I think I find it a very instructive idea. And yes, the king still has problems on the back rank. However, a little pawn nudge like h6 will actually solve that. And with the rook, maybe on g6. In fact, the king is pretty well covered. Excuse me. In any case, Nakamura played in the pretty standard way, b5. And the king nudged to the side. So b4 is possible if white were to exchange. Opening up the b file, then this looks really very pleasant for black. But the problem is knight a2, taking this pawn. But black can break through. But this endgame is pretty balanced because white is able to break through here. I mean, it's probably about equal after this and so on. But, if black wanted to sort of clear the situation, then that is possible. But Nakamura played queen b6. So he wants to play b4, but doesn't want to end up in this pin. Rook e4, preventing this, but also maybe looking at sacrificing the exchange. So, for example, if a5, then this is possible. Knight d5. Well, it's not even an exchange sack because the knight can check on e7. Queen c7, the queen comes back again. And if rook takes in this case, then you can take on c3. And that looks pleasant for black. So, rook e1 played. So there's all kinds of little tricks taking place here. Still got to watch out for this and, potentially something happening here. So, for example, Nakamura took on c3. I think that's a very tempting move to play. Absolutely standard Sicilian exchange sacrifice to damage the pawns. And it's not just about damaging those pawns. It's making sure that that knight doesn't land on d5, which could be very, very nasty. Now, don't take here. That will be a mistake. As I pointed out a moment ago, there are back rank problems. So Nakamura brought the knight back to e6. That looks like a solid move. But white is actually doing okay now. It would have been better instead to play queen c6 with the idea of hopping the knight round to d5. But this is a very subtle move. There's no way you're going to find this when you're short of time. Rook d1. Yeah, pressure here. And white is actually doing okay. It's very interesting to see how Abdusattorov has managed to turn a difficult position in the opening into actually rather a good position. And here, if he continued with rook e3 to d3, just putting pressure on that pawn, he's actually got a really good position, because if knight c5, stopping that, then you can take there. There's a pin on the d file. But he took on g7 instead, also very dangerous. But curiously, this kind of solves black's back rank problem. Whereas if you maintain the pawn on f6, then those back rank tricks with here, they're actually really nasty. Anyway, pawn takes pawn on g7. d5. So now it's getting completely random. This rook is attacking, but black is powering through the middle of the board. Is it good? Is it bad? Who knows? Queen e3. Queen e5. And here, still good for white, actually, if rook f1 is played with pressure here. But no, queen b6. Maybe the wrong direction. Queen takes g5, but it's just random here. After rook g4, in fact, the queen should go back to f6. And completely unclear. But queen e5 played by Nakamura. And again, if white returns to the f-file and starts attacking here, this is actually very good for white. So, for example, if e3, rook takes f7, king takes, queen takes rook, and that pawn comes good. But after queen e5, Abdusattorov took on a6, and this really is heading in the wrong direction, because after e3, then Nakamura took the initiative, and it's looking good for black now. The game ended like this. Queen takes c3, and after queen d4, e2 was a winning move. If queen takes queen, first of all you throw in pawn takes rook, check, and you get a new queen, and then you take this one. And otherwise there is simply no defense to queening and taking here, and basically the whole thing has completely collapsed. Pretty random game in the last sort of 10 or 15 moves. But I think what we can say is that Nakamura's opening was a success, and well, it's extraordinary that Abdusattorov actually overlooked this move knight g4, which just gave black an excellent position. In their Armageddon game, there was another Kalashnikov. They reached this position. I mean, I find it extraordinary that Abdusattorov actually repeated this, but in fact Nakamura varied, and he played castles, and the game went bishop d3, and now the classic Kalashnikov liberation move, liberation station, all aboard. If you get in d5, normally black doesn't have any difficulties, and indeed after pawn takes pawn, now don't take there, I think we all know that that would be a mistake, but knight b4 from Nakamura. And after this, basically black has already equalised the position. This is a very favourable pawn structure for black. The 4-2 against 3-3. It's a very common theme in the Kalashnikov. Now in the game, in fact, this position is just basically equal. It's roughly level already. But, well, when you're playing rapidly, things can go wrong, and actually Nakamura ended up losing this endgame, but at this stage it's basically level. So there you go. A little Kalashnikov update, but in general I wouldn't recommend knight e2. And yes, if you're interested in a very suitable present for this time of year, then I would recommend my book or the Chessball course. Thanks for watching.